All right, then. Welcome back to this lecture series in United States history. Today's talk I'm titling World War II on the American Home Front, and I'm going to walk you along America's path, bumpy and complicated and in some ways convoluted as it was, into World War II. And having joined that war effort, we'll talk about the American economy and how America, once again, like she did during World War I, experimented with socialism, what we call war socialism, what some people call the welfare warfare state. And after walking you through the transition to the wartime economy, the radical transition to the wartime economy, we'll look at the ways in which African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans participated in the war effort, but also negotiated challenging times at home. We'll also look at the ways in which women negotiated the war effort and complicated times at home. After we do that, we'll look at Japanese internment. We tend to call it Japanese internment, but I have a problem with that framing of it because a lot of the people who were interned were Americans, full-blooded red, white, and blue Americans, and they too were interned. And so there's this misleading problem when we call it Japanese internment because it presumes in the language that the United States interned Japanese people. They did not. Executive Order 9066 interned American people of Japanese ancestry. And so that's the brackets on the word American. And then we will talk about the atomic bombs, the dropping of 2 bombs in 3 days, first on Hiroshima, then on Nagasaki, leading to, of course, the end of the war. You see here, and I'm sure you will recognize it as a Dr. Seuss cartoon, and we have Uncle Sam sleeping comfortably in his bed, separate from Europe where you have Hitleritis and Blitzpox and Nazi fever and fascist fever. And ho-hum, no chance of contagion. And this is obviously Dr. Seuss's critique of American isolation, quote unquote isolation. And of course, that contagion does reach over that little small gap between these 2 beds. I begin with this because I want you to know that I will be using World War II propaganda, including but not limited to the propaganda of one Theodore Geisel, Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss. I'll be using his political cartoons as well as others to illustrate a lot of the points I want to make today. So let's dive right in. Enough wheel spinning here. Let's get on the road to war. This here is the America First Committee. Charles Lindbergh speaking at the helm, the spokesman, Charles Lindbergh. We'll talk about him in a second. The overwhelming majority of American people wanted nothing to do with World War II in the way that the overwhelming majority of American people wanted nothing to do with World War I. America ended up joining both wars late, playing important and in some ways decisive roles in both wars. And what we want to do here is to walk along the road from peace, isolation, and insularity to war. So let's start here. 1933, Hitler seizes power in Germany. Fascist movements are, burning throughout Europe. And in this context, but also in the context of the Great Depression and the anti-business sentiment that defined, in many ways, the Great Depression, the honorable gentleman from North Dakota, the Republican Gerald Nye, he launched an investigatory commission which looked into arms sales and manufacturing during World War I. And what the commission found was that American financiers and manufacturers were making money hand over fist. The historian and, in full disclosure, activist anti-war activist Dorothy Detzer said, quote, "The committee produced a sordid report of intrigues and bribery, of collusion and excessive profits, of war scares artificially fostered and disarmament conferences deliberately wrecked." So basically, what Detzer is reflecting on here is the committee's findings that American financiers and manufacturers were doing everything they could to dragoon Americans into war so that they could make profits. And while this wasn't, proven beyond the shadow of a reasonable doubt, there were 93 hearings and more than 200 witnesses. And the Nye Committee was daily news for Americans who were paying attention to politics. And this news furthered the sense of isolation in America. Americans wanted to make the Atlantic yet even bigger. Now, just to give a sense of where this thing concluded after, a couple years, I think it was 18 months of hearings, Nye and his committee were shut down when Nye sort of stepped over the Rubicon when he started speaking in rather blunt terms about the credibility of Woodrow Wilson. And this, of course, was at a time when you wouldn't speak about the dead in just in terms like that, in desultory terms. But you wouldn't speak about the president of the United States, living or dead, with ungentlemanly language. And Nye was really, impugning Wilson's character. And so the Senate shut him down. But I bring up the Nye committee to show you that this is like emblematic of the spirit of isolation. Like, what was Congress up to after, Hitler seized power and after fascism was firmly implanted in Italy, and Franco was on the rise in Spain, and the U.S. Congress was looking at what went wrong during World War I to make sure that the U.S. never falls prey to the temptations of war again. That's 1934. And with that spirit, the U.S. Congress passes a series of neutrality acts. There are 4 of them in total. The first one had a very strict arms embargo. There was an agency that was created by the first Neutrality Act to think about arms sales and how arms sales to France and Britain could be carried out legally and safely. But the first Neutrality Act was still like a total embargo. U.S. citizens could still travel around the world, but they did that at their own risk. And when the first Neutrality Act expired, a second one, actually, when the first one expired, it was renewed for 14 months. And then a second Neutrality Act was passed in February of 36. And it created explicit prohibitions of giving loans or credit to belligerent nations. And importantly, it very explicitly said that the United States could not interfere in the Spanish Civil War, going so far as to recognize Francisco Franco's fascist regime. Okay. So the U.S., recognizing that there are very serious problems, that and that there's a temptation to intercede, the U.S. is very strict in its efforts not to intercede in European problems. All right. And emblematic of this, again in 1937, the distinguished gentleman from Indiana, Louis Ludlow, he proposed a referendum to the American Constitution, which, were it to pass, would have made it such that the United States Congress could not declare war without a referendum. Right? His argument was, and I'm quoting here, the amendment would do more to keep American boys out of slaughter pens in foreign countries than any other measure that could be passed. It's based on the philosophy that those who have to suffer and, if need be, to die and to bear the awful burdens and griefs of war shall have something to say about whether war should be declared. So democracy in action is what Louis Ludlow wants. It never got out of committee. It surely was not an amendment to the Constitution, but it was emblematic, again, of the sentiment of the American people and their representatives in Congress. And FDR was on the same page, right? Again, in 1937, he wants to keep America isolated. He doesn't want America going to war, but he is concerned about what's happening in Europe and how this could be a contagious disease. And he gave, in the autumn of 1937, a speech which had a lot of resonance with the American people. This was in one of his fireside chats. And he said, when an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. How timely, right? I record this, of course, in the throes of a pandemic. And so Roosevelt implying here that the United States had some role, maybe a special role, maybe a decisive role, but surely some role in quarantining fascism. And the American public was concerned, and the Republican Party was concerned about former President Herbert Hoover, in speaking to the Council on Foreign Relations, openly, publicly rebuked FDR for urging a concerted action to create peace. What Hoover was concerned about, Hoover, who had experience as an engineer in Asia, he was concerned about FDR stoking war with Japan, which, as you'll see, arguably Roosevelt did, though I would not say he did so intentionally. Okay. Still in 1937, we have this strange incident where Japan is at war with China, and there's an American military vessel, the USS Panay, and it's patrolling the Yangtze River near what was then called Nanking. And two Americans who were aboard this boat, they were escorting a Standard Oil tanker. Two Americans were killed. And, of course, you would think that the American public would be like, we need to, revenge this. We need to bring justice to those who killed innocent Americans who weren't doing anything other than guarding oil. Of course, this was, oil that was going to be, used to support the Chinese war effort against Japan. But still, you would think that the American public would, jump to their feet and demand a call to arms. But instead, the American people were like, why are there American Navy ships in China? We're not at war in Asia. And a lot of people were afraid of what happened off the coast of Cuba in 1898, when the Maine was there. There was, it turned out, an internal combustion on the USS Maine, and that sort of dragooned Americans into war. So there was real concern in 1935, 36, 37 about America getting suckered into a war. For their part, Japan said, we're really sorry. We'll pay for it. We didn't know that it was an American ship. It was a mistake, which may or may not be true, but it was a show of good faith of the Japanese government to a certain level, right? Or at least trying to avoid war with the United States. I'm staying in 1937 because here we have the Third Neutrality Act, and we have Dr. Seuss commenting on it. In 1937, the Third Neutrality Act was passed, and it is a turning point in the American path towards war. The Third Neutrality Act led to the so-called cash and carry system. It is what it sounds like. Belligerent countries, France and Britain, our allies, if they paid in cash, we weren't going to extend credit to them. We weren't going to give them loans. If they paid cash for weapons and they put them on their own ships, America would happily sell them weapons. U.S. ships couldn't do that. What's interesting about this is that when in October of 1937, Japan invaded China, Japan didn't officially declare war on China. So FDR was able to continue to lend and lease weapons to China to combat Japan. Yeah. And here's Dr. Seuss, sort of perched in this precarious position, confident but foolishly so, with the Neutrality Act. Yeah. Okay. So that's 1937, the Third Neutrality Act. And the fourth one was in November of 1939. This, of course, is about 2 months after the German invasion of Poland, September 9th of 39. The U.S. then repealed the arms embargo and allowed belligerent nations to purchase, and this could be seen as the end of American neutrality. And as we move into the summer and the autumn of 1940, we just see World War II moving in the wrong direction. I say wrong direction because I'm anti-Nazi. That's sort of my thing. So by June of 1940, Germany had defeated Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium, and they had occupied and set up a puppet government in France. By September of 1940, Germany had created a formal alliance with Italy and Japan, such that these three Axis powers, if war was declared on any one of them, the other two would thus declare war on the belligerent nation. So things aren't looking good for the forces of democracy, for the Allied forces in World War II in 1940. And so what we see is a changing set of policies, not necessarily based on a changing ideology per se, or a changing set of opinions by the Roosevelt administration, but changing circumstances on the ground. Okay. And we see this change in September of 1940. Politically, it was kind of interesting because in the weeks leading up to the election of 1940, the election for FDR's third term, in an effort to not be seen as weak on the war, as cowardly on the war, FDR brought two war hawks into his cabinet, Stimson and Knox, who ran the War Department and the Navy Department, respectively. And he did this in part to head off energy that Wendell Willkie was getting, his Republican opponent in the election of 1940. He wanted to head off some momentum that Willkie was getting. He also, I think it's fair to say, through the summer of 1940, saw the need to bring more hawkish people into his cabinet. And at the end of the summer of 1940, he pushed through Congress the Burke Wadsworth Selective Training and Service Act, which was America's first peacetime draft. It registered all men ages 18 to 35. And by the autumn, you had 15, 20 million Americans registered, and you had a draft that was beginning. They called it preparedness without war. So when you look at September of 1940, when you look at the autumn of 1940, did FDR see the writing on the wall? Did America know it was going to war? If not, did FDR think we were going to war? These are very real, very difficult questions. And there were, as FDR was moving towards war, there were very strong voices against war. And one of the strongest and in some ways most complicated and interesting voices for isolationism, which is to say against war, was the America First Committee. The America First Committee was founded at Yale, New Haven, Connecticut, by the heir to the Quaker Oats dynasty, Robert Stewart. And their slogan was, "England will fight to the last American, which is basically to say that they're doing the courageous thing, and we don't need to put boots on boys. The America First Committee had 800,000 dues-paying members, and tens of millions of more people who were supportive without paying dues. But some of those members were really influential people. Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motors, a legend of business, also a legendary anti-Semite, which in some ways informs his desire to stay out of the war. The eldest daughter of Teddy Roosevelt, Alice Roosevelt Longsworth, JFK, and Gerald Ford were members of the America First Committee. And so there were America Firsters who really wanted to stay out of war for valid reasons. And I would say that JFK was among them. He sent a $100 check to the America First Committee with a letter that we can read where he's just very earnest in his desire to stay out of war. Of course, JFK himself ended up going into war, winning a Purple Heart and nearly losing his life. The problem with the America First Committee, as we look back on it, is that its spokesman was Charles Lindbergh. Now, we know Lindbergh from the hero who took the first transatlantic flight. But Lindbergh, in addition to having that sort of courage and moxie and technical grace, he was a eugenicist, a raging anti-Semite, and just a world-class racist. And he became the spokesperson for the America First Committee. And the speeches he gave were saying that, Germany would never, think about, attacking America, that the Germans, they have no beef with the Americans at all, and that the French and the British, but also the Russians, were conspiring against Germany, that the French and the British were the ones who were out, conquering the world and gobbling up colonies. And along with the USSR, they were seeking to suffocate Germany, which is not untrue, but that's not really like the dominant story of German aggression, at least in my humble opinion. And ultimately, Lindbergh was saying, look, France dominated the continent, and they, for good and for evil, if Germany dominated Europe, why is that such a bad thing? We have plenty of, good red-blooded Americans of German ancestry. Why is it bad if Germany is the dominant power in Europe? And of course, there's a real easy answer to that, right? Because this isn't like Germany in 2021. This is Germany in 1935, 1940, 1941. And so it's not like a German-dominated Europe we're talking about a Nazi fascist-dominated Europe, which didn't really bother Lindbergh because Lindbergh was, not just an anti-Semite for his time, but an anti-Semite for all time, And he would give speeches where he talks about how the Jews own the media, the Jews own the press. And he said, and I quote, "We must ask who owns and influences the newspaper, the news picture, and the radio station. If our people know the truth, our country is not likely to enter the war," right? And the truth is the Jews are just, grotesque and selfish and greedy, and they need to be obliterated. And when Lindbergh got together with Henry Ford, and we have this from Henry Ford's diaries. Henry Ford talks about, how Lindbergh would come over, and the two of them, all they talked about was how awful Jews are. That's like what they talked about for fun. This is from Henry Ford's diaries. So in this way, the America First Committee, as this voice of isolation, is really complicated because there are, democracy-loving, red-blooded American, decent people who wanted to stay isolated, but the lead voice for isolation in the form of Charles Lindbergh came from such a grotesque place that, that it becomes all sorts of problematic. And it's also problematic that as tensions are rising and violence is rising, and our allies are falling, American allies are falling in Europe, it's an election year, right? So in the summer and autumn of 1940, we have the Battle of Britain, just so destructive, so raucous and impossible. And in part because of that, we see that the American people are moving maybe towards a willingness to go to war. There was a Christmas a poll taken around Christmas time in 1940, and it revealed that 39% of Americans believed the U.S. made a mistake in participating in World War I. But that same question asked 3 years before, the result was 64%. So fewer and fewer Americans, substantially fewer Americans, believe that it was a mistake to go to World War I. And that's an interesting data point. Now, of course, that doesn't say anything about whether they wanted to go to World War II. I mean, nobody wants to go. But you could see the public opinion softening. If there was to be a Ludlow Amendment in December of 1940, where the American people were to, vote for or against war, it would be interesting to see what that result would be. I think it probably depends on how the issue was framed and who was framing it. Yeah. But in the election of 1940, Wendell Willkie, who was FDR's political opponent for that election, Wendell Willkie was also a Democrat prior to 1940. He had no real political clout. He was a total dark horse candidate. It was Robert Taft was the heir apparent to the Republican throne, who had a chance to defeat FDR, for it was FDR's third term, and there was a strong argument for that. But because of an interesting Republican convention in the summer of 1940, this nobody, Wendell Willkie, who was a Democrat the year before, won the Republican ticket. The distinguished gentleman, Senator Watson from Indiana, said, and I think this is a quote here, I should quote it, "It's fine if the town whore joined the church, but she might not try to lead the choir in the first week." So, which is to say, Wendell Willkie didn't have a whole lot of support from his own party. But look, it was still a 55-45 split in the popular vote. Wendell Willkie got 45% of Americans' votes. He got hammered in the Electoral College, but that says something, right? FDR, who goes down as surely one of the top 5 presidents in American history. Most historians have him as number 3, right? Lincoln, Washington, FDR. But usually always he's in the top 5. He won by a reasonably small margin in the popular vote. Here's what the map looked like. Overwhelming victory for FDR. And we should pause on this for a second, because there is an argument that what FDR was trying to do in 1939 and 1940 was to keep America out of war for the purposes of his reelection. I don't see there's no smoking gun evidence for that. And I don't see a lot of evidence for that, period. But there are those who argue that. There are smart people who make that argument. There is evidence for it. My read on it is that the landscape of the war changed and FDR's opinion changed with it. There are more cynical voices on FDR than mine, and feel free to listen to them. But surely the tides were turning, and here we have 2 Dr. Seuss cartoons. On the left, we have the America Firsters, reading the story of Adolf the wolf, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter. That's the America First. That's Dr. Seuss's take on America Firsters. And then on the right, we have this other Dr. Seuss cartoon where we have the appeaser who, when you show him on the inside, he has no guts at all. By the way, I should say that while Dr. Seuss might have been on the right side of the European war, if you're of this opinion, he did publish a series of cartoons which were anything but kind or decent to Japanese Americans with regard to, including Americans, right? American Americans, right? Japanese Americans. And so, his record is hardly unblemished. I think we should note that. But that's, Yeah, duly noted. The tides were turning. Americans were more inclined towards participation. FDR was more inclined towards participation. And this is illustrated in his 1940 speech, a fireside chat, after he won the election in November, before he's inaugurated for his third term. He says, quote, "Suppose my neighbor's house catches fire, and I have a length of garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he could take my garden hose and connect it up to his hydrant, I may help to put him out the fire. I may help to put out the fire. Sorry. Now, what do? I don't say to him before that operation, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. What's the transaction that goes on? I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over." And this was the logic that FDR deployed to pass through Congress the Lend Lease Act. In the beginning, Lend Lease appropriated $7 billion to the French and British almost exclusively, the Belgians as well. By the time Lend Lease was over, the U.S. government had given about $51 billion. That's $900 billion today. I just looked it up. So the U.S. lent and leased about $1 trillion worth of munitions and war materials to the Allied powers. It's an astounding sum of money. And let us hope that Europeans don't forget that. Say what you will of the transatlantic relationship, that's $1 trillion. And that's just the beginning, right? We'll look later on at what the United States did to support Western Europe after the war. Now, by the way, I'm not implying anything when I say that, but I do think it should be noted. Like, I'm not suggesting a course of action other than perhaps we shouldn't forget, such as my mission as a as a history teacher. Okay, so that's December of 1940. And then when he takes office for his third term in his third State of the Union address, or I guess it would have been his ninth, he gives his famous four freedoms speech: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. So the two freedoms of and the two freedoms from. And this is his pivot, some say, that in order to protect these freedoms and to save ourselves, we're going to have to become more active in interceding in the war effort. 6 months later, at the end of the summer, he went out to Newfoundland and he sat next to Churchill, and they signed together the Atlantic Charter. And the U.S. was clear: look, we're not looking to gain any territory. We don't want any colonies. What we want is disarmament. We want a renunciation of war as an instrument of foreign policy. We want all people to be able to determine their futures, which is code for, hey, Britain and France, why don't you give up some of your colonies? Like, you own half the world. Probably should have given them up after World War I. Probably shouldn't have had them at all, but whatever, the U.S. had a couple too, so there's that. A reduction of trade barriers, freedom of the seas, freedom from want and fear, and then global cooperation and the basis for the United Nations. The Atlantic Charter is the foundation for that. And so what the Atlantic Charter does, in effect, is it tries to set the stage for a post-war spirit. And of course, if the United States is going to be central to establishing that spirit, then the United States might be willing to fight for it. That's one read on it. It could also just be read as a document of hope and not a political document at all. I don't tend to read it that way. And the Atlantic Charter was necessary because in June of 1941, Germany violated the Nazi-Soviet pact and violated Stalin's Soviet Union and attacked the Soviet Union. The U.S. immediately gave aid to the USSR, supporting this heartthrob, Stalin. This is young Stalin. This is actually his prison mugshot from the 19 teens as a young Bolshevik. Not a bad mugshot. And, Stalin aged reasonably well. This is Stalin in the early 1940s on the right in Women's Weekly, still sort of a heartthrob with a perfectly coiffed mustache and a pipe. And this propaganda poster is real. Like it's unbelievable, but it's real. This man is your friend. He fights for freedom. Russian. So, not all propaganda is subtle. Some of it's really on the nose. The point is that the United States was now not just supporting the French and the British, but supporting the Soviet Union, which, the Soviet Union whose ideology is antithetical to the United States, both in terms of the politics of totalitarianism, and, make no mistake about it, Stalin's a totalitarian, but also on the economic front, ideological communism is an affront to most Americans' sensibilities then and now. So that's yet another turning point. We're seeing the path. We're seeing the road to war. I'm just taking you step by step along what I think are the most major stopping points or turning points. But you see, you know where this is going, right? But now you're seeing it happen. Now, as the U.S. was becoming more and more active in European politics, Japanese-American relationships were deteriorating, and this goes way back. You think about the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. Japanese-American relations weren't good throughout the 20th century until the 1970s and 80s, when Japan became a very close ally. In his quarantine speech, FDR argued that Japan should be treated like a disease, that they should be sanctioned. The U.S. refused to trade with Japan. They refused to sell them fuel or iron. They froze Japanese assets in American banks in July of 41, right? And if that weren't enough, and maybe they could have gotten away with all of that, right? But if that weren't enough, they aid China. The United States didn't have a particularly positive relationship with China either. As we know, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese people were treated worse than dogs, as Thomas Nast was quick to illustrate. The endemic racism, anti-Asian, but particularly anti-Chinese racism, was very problematic in the United States. But didn't stop the U.S. from aiding China. $125 million by 1940. They sent a fleet, naval vessels to Pearl Harbor in 1940 to watch Japan closely. They extended Lend Lease aid to China. And then in a strange chapter, the U.S. sent what they called volunteers, a volunteer of, Air Force squadrons, which, by the way, if you're in the Air Force, you don't get to volunteer, right? You follow orders. So it was all, anyway, they sent an aerial mission to China to protect, because the Chinese had no Air Force. So to protect their ally, the U.S. sent quote unquote volunteers to go protect their Chinese ally. And this is, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but, the U.S. was provoking Japan. I think we could say that as a statement of fact. That doesn't follow that Japan was justified in her response. I would not say that. But if you're watching what's going on in the summer of 41, the spring of 41, you could see the writing on the wall. Yeah, you could see America getting pulled into a war in Asia. And then in the fall of 41, Japan occupied Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, then called French Indochina. The U.S. mobilized forces in the Philippines under Douglas MacArthur, a war hero by all accounts. And they warned Japan, if next move where we're coming after you. And the U.S. ambassador to Japan at that time, a fellow named Joseph Grew, said, "You look, this tough talk is going to drag us into a war. The Japanese look like they're going to attack." Grew thought they would attack the Philippines, but they ended up attacking Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, a date which shall live in infamy. 2,400 civilians killed, about 1,200 wounded, 19 ships sunk or destroyed, and 170 planes destroyed. It wasn't just Pearl Harbor, although that's the one we remember. Never forget. There were also attacks in the Philippines and Wake Island, Guam, Midway Islands, and on British forces in Hong Kong. And then after they attacked all of those targets, then they declared war. So that's some like sneaky, nasty stuff. It's awful. Shame on you, Japan. What can I tell you? And in response for that, the U.S. Declared war on Japan, overwhelming in both the House and the Senate. There was only one vote in both august bodies. It was the vote of Jeanette Rankin, the Montana representative. She voted against World War I as well. And then, of course, Italy and Germany, because of the Axis Pact, they reciprocated and declared war on the U.S. So America is at war. And if you're wanting to take a break, now is not a bad time to do it. I'm not going to, because I have my coffee, so I can just keep going. It's called go-go juice. So with America in the war, America had a pressing interest in winning it. And to win it, you had to make sure that the economy was running full steam ahead. And you have to work to make it happen. And so we enter what we call the warfare welfare state, which I will call war socialism. I made this argument in my lecture about World War I. When America has big fish to fry, they tend to pivot towards socialism. The Office of Price Administration, which was established by Executive Order 8875, led the country from capitalism, asterisk, New Deal capitalism, welfare capitalism, call it what you want, to what was irrefutably socialism, war socialism. Corporate taxes were 40%. Taxes raised about half of the war costs. War bonds raised the rest, and we'll talk about that. In 1939, when the war in Europe started, 4 million Americans filed taxes. By the end of the war, 50 million were tax filers, and Americans were proud to pay their taxes. Here we have the top marginal tax rate. So like when you're in the top 5 or 10%, like the richest 5% of Americans. Today, you pay actually it's about 33%. Maybe it's 36 now. But during the war, you paid, what's that, 90%? I think it was 90%. So if you're a millionaire, you're big CEO, you make $1 million a year, you get 100,000. The rest goes to the state. Now, I know these numbers are hard to see on the bottom here, but this year is when the U.S. gets into World War II. And this graph on the bottom is federal, state, and local income taxes as a percentage of the U.S. GDP. So the percentage of U.S. GDP that comes from taxes. And you see this during the war, you see this astounding rise of taxes as a percentage of GDP. Prior to World War II, Americans pretty much didn't pay taxes, and they surely didn't pay federal taxes. So this is a turning point in the role of the federal government. This is a turning point, thus, in the expectations of the federal government. This is socialism. When the richest pay 90% of their income, and the next bracket down was 30, then 20%. So there's a big leap. So it wasn't particularly progressive. But when people pay their taxes, and in this case, when people are kind of proud to pay their taxes as like their American duty, their civic duty. That's socialism, and Americans were proud to do it. And I made this argument when I talked about the war socialism during World War I. Look, if American people have a cause that they're fighting for and a cause that they can rally behind, whether the enemy is Hitler or the enemy is climate change, and the American people, or the enemy is a pandemic, the American people are willing to, they have it in their DNA to band together and to make sacrifices, economic and otherwise. And we're going to talk about that today. So you have the OPA, and you had price and rent controls. That's socialism. They sold war bonds, they encouraged victory gardens, and the OPA established the OES, the Office of Economic Stabilization. The Office of Economic Stabilization demanded rationing. You needed a certificate to buy a car, or to buy tires for your car, or to buy typewriters, because these things, the material that go into cars and tires and typewriters, were needed for the war effort. During World War II, you had rationing coupons. When you went to the store, you had to present, along with the money you pay for it, a coupon to buy meat or coffee or sugar. You needed to have a coupon to put gas in your car, because these are things that were needed for the war effort. And yes, there was a black market for coupons. And yes, not everybody was a law-abiding citizen when it came to rationing, but most Americans were. They were willing to forego meat. These are Americans I'm talking about, They're willing to forego meat, use less coffee, to drive less, to carpool, because they wanted to win the war. They wanted to defeat fascism. They wanted to protect democracy. They wanted to save the lives of their sons and daughters. And the Office of Economic Stabilization did what it was meant to do, which was to stabilize the economy. During World War I, the cost of living skyrocketed 170%. During World War II, the cost of living was very, very stable. I mean, there was an increase of less than 30%. And that sounds like a lot, but it wasn't really so bad because of rent controls and price controls. The cost of all of this, by the way, was the national debt. In 1941, the U.S. national debt was $50 billion. And by the war's end, it was 5 times that. So this is the beginning of the American federal government debt cycle, which really, really took off in the 1980s, as we'll see. Socialism. I say it without, judgment or suggestion. War socialism, rationing, rent controls, price controls, government control of the economy through the War Production Board, Executive Order 9042. Look, capitalism is awesome, but there's a lot of built-in inefficiencies to capitalism, right? If companies and corporations are competing to destroy the other, that competition, the nature of the competition, first of all, it's not always fair, but it could eventually lead to less goods on the market, and the goods that are on the market could end up being monopolized. So in order to mitigate the inefficiencies of capitalism when it is inefficient, the War Production Board allocated materials. They established industrial production priorities. They distributed materials, and things that weren't necessary, like women's stockings, for example, were prohibited. You can't make those stockings, right? Because we need the war materials to defeat the fascists. Rationing of gas and metals and rubber, converting civilian industry into war production, a 15-fold increase in aircraft production. Factories that used to make parachutes or make silk ribbons are now they're making parachutes. Factories that used to build cars are now making tanks. Typewriter companies are now making rifles. A full-time, full-throttle government oversight of the economy, controlling the means of production by establishing quotas and a rationing system. And it was insanely successful. It was insanely successful. The United States produced about 40% of the global output of munitions. The United States alone produced twice as many war materials as the Axis countries combined. It was one of the greatest government feats, if not the greatest government feat in American history. And it was made possible through some of the thinking and some of the bureaucracy of the New Deal. Just a what if question, which I try not to trample in, but like, what if it was a Harding or a Coolidge or a Hoover who was trying to manage this without, or what if it was FDR trying to do what he was trying to do in 1932 instead of 1941 after, a decade of federal mismanagement. Yeah. So you think about how the New Deal fortuitously set the federal government up to defeat fascism. Maybe not once and for all, but for a long time. And so we have to get the American people on board. We have some propaganda I want to show you. On the left, we have, Uncle Sam's hand, an industrial worker's hand, and it's like a CEO's hand, and they're all shaking hands. The laborers and the corporate tycoons and the government, we're all in this together, tripartite victory. And then, to take pride in your work, here's a little reminder. This little girl, sweet little kid, she's got a picture of her dad who's a soldier under her arm, and what you're making may save my daddy's life. And you don't know. You could be working in a screw factory. You don't know if those screws are going into tanks. You could be working at a coffee factory. You don't know if the coffee factory, the coffee's going to GIs or if it's going to people down the street. But like, what you're saying may save my daddy's life. So people went to work. They showed up on time. They worked the hardest. Maybe not for profit. Maybe not because they loved the job, but because they believed in the cause. They wanted to destroy fascism. They wanted to support the men and women at war. Yeah. Here's this woman. She's making a pledge that she'll pay no more than top legal prices, and that she won't accept any black market ration goods. So that's some propaganda from 1943. On the right, we have the cost of living. Sort of justifying the rationing. The cost of living was more livable, for want of a better word, during World War II than it was in World War I. Yeah. And to get people to buy war bonds, use women and children. On the left, buy war bonds, or this Japanese guy is going to slit your wife's throat. Little on the nose. A little less subtle, buy war bonds, or your children are going to be killed by Nazis. They're coming for you. They're in the sky. They're going to get your kids when they're playing in the backyard. The Nazis are coming. You don't want them? Buy a war bond. And then, I know Europeans have a sense that Americans can't save, that they're too wasteful. They were the best during World War II. You fried bacon, you save the bacon fat for explosives. You bring them, you bring your, the oils and the fats from your cooking back to the butcher, and the butcher would collect them, and the government would come by every week or every month, I don't know, to use those fats for explosives. Waste helps the enemy. There's Hitler on a piece of paper. Conserve. Join a car sharing club. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. They should do that today. When you ride alone, you ride with the, with the supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, right? Iranian gas. Or you ride with Putin, the Russian gas. And then this terribly problematic poster. Every time you twist a nut, think of Hitler. I don't know what to say about all that, but there. That's problematic propaganda for you. And look, you could do that today, right? 2021. You want Americans to drive less? Give them a good lesson in, who's making money off of the petrol that they use. Maybe that'll encourage them. Maybe not. So, Hitler, is obviously synonymous with racism, bigotry. And I think to a lot of, young kind of progressive students, America is synonymous with racism and bigotry. And you've been taking this class and you've been thinking, and, America is large and it contains multitudes. And, we do have this original sin. And we talk about this a lot in class, the history of racial, ethnic, religious, gender relations in the United States. And look, I don't operate in a Marvel, a DC Comics universe. Like I'm not a good versus evil type. And I don't want to dive too far into the problematics of all of that, but I do want to dive in a little bit here to the sort of the stories that are less told in the American history story about World War II, which is to say the story of African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans, focusing most and first on the African American war experiences. And look, like everything else, like there's shelves of books that are written about this. I'm going to talk about it for a few minutes. It's a survey course. It's oversimplification, but I do want to touch on a few things, right? So in the armed forces, you had more than 1 million African Americans. They were segregated until the Truman administration. They were generally in support roles, not as much frontline roles. You had about 500,000 Latinos, the majority of whom were Mexican American. They did have a lot of frontline action. You had 500,000 Jewish Americans, about 50,000 Asian Americans, and 25,000 Native Americans who served in war. Right, so they had to fight for the flag, a flag that they probably had a complicated relationship with, about which we will talk. So given that complicated relationship, why did they fight? Well, they fought because they were drafted. Like they went to the army a lot, probably most of them, because their number was called and is the honorable thing to do. It's better than jail. It's what you do when your number's called. It's the law, Perhaps they wanted their draft number called. Perhaps they volunteered for war because it's a good job being in the military. If you survive it, you get paid. You get combat pay, and you come back and you get the GI Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about in a forthcoming lecture. A lot of African Americans wanted to fight against fascism because while America has a disgusting record on race relations, sorry, but Germany is worse at that time. We're talking about a genocide, right? So I don't think I have to argue that case too hard. I'm not going to, because it's a matter of fact, right? And a lot of African American leaders, including W.B. Du Bois, thought that by registering for the draft and for volunteering for war, that African Americans could enjoy a victory over fascism abroad and a victory over racism at home. And look, there are critics who believe that African Americans were sold a bill of goods, and that the propaganda machines were trying to convince Black people to go fight and die to kill racists when there were plenty of racists at home that maybe should have been killed or at least imprisoned. And so, you can be as empathic as you can and think about what it must be like to be an African American in the 1940s and put on an American uniform, knowing the history. It's endlessly challenging to think about. And so every person of color, had to negotiate their own ethical code and their own sense of honor and dignity and patriotism, should that be the case, right? A lot of Black people, a lot of people of color fought because they hoped that by making the ultimate sacrifice, that their children and children's children would have a better life. And look, there is no doubt that the health and safety of the African American communities in the United States were better after World War II. Maybe not because of World War II, but having something to do with it. World War II does mark a turning point in the way African Americans were treated. It's still a huge problem, and we'll talk about all those problems as we move forward in this class. Okay, so you have African Americans who did go out and fight, and they did risk life and limb, but you have troops like the Tuskegee Airmen who did all of the things that white Air Force people did. What do you call them? Air Force people, for want of a better word. But they didn't get treated as well. Joseph Gomer, who lived well into his 70s, he said that the Germans treated us better than the Americans did. Our service is something that never got into the history books. It was just ignored. Well, Mr. Gomer, I'm trying not to ignore it. And thank you for your service and risking life and limb to kill Nazis. Yeah. And at home, African Americans had an equally challenging experience because you have the Great Migration that began in the 19-teens and went on to the 1920s. And then during the Depression, the Great Migration sort of morphed. But during the 1940s, you have Blacks who are coming to industrial centers and they're competing for housing and they're working alongside white people and the tensions are real high. And so you have race riots in more than 50 cities. And the biggest one was in Detroit in 1943 because, white people didn't want to, suffer the quote unquote indignity of having to live near or work with Black people because they were racists. And we're not talking about Alabama, Mississippi. We're talking about Detroit. It's really important, to see racism as an American problem, not like a Southern problem. Yeah. Detroit's population, because of Detroit industry, it blew up during the war. Competition for housing was brutal. The federal troops were called in. There was $2 million worth of property damage, 25 dead Black people, 9 dead white people, hundreds wounded. So you have a war at home, you have a war abroad, you have racism abroad, you have racism at home. It's complicated times, and African Americans were just, stuck in the middle of it again. Yeah. Now, they wanted to become unstuck. And one of my hometown heroes, Asa Philip Randolph, they actually just devoted a real nice little kind of humble museum to him on the south side of Chicago. A. Philip Randolph was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. These were if you took a long haul train in the United States, and you get meals served to you. It was kind of first class experience for a lot of people. And African Americans would ride the trains across the country, away from their families, serving, basically first class ticket holders. And Randolph was the president of the union of the Black men who rode the rails. And A. Philip Randolph was angry, as Black people were angry, that a lot of Black people weren't enjoying the fruits of war in the way that white people were. And he demanded that FDR create equal access to defense jobs so Blacks and whites could, enjoy the fruits of their labor equally, that the armed forces be desegregated, and that FDR end segregation in the federal government. And he said, if you don't meet these 3 demands, we're going to march on Washington. And they set up posters and they were ready to roll. This is, real threatening stuff. And so what FDR did is he answered one of the demands. He established Executive Order 8802, which was the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Committee, that said that defense industries would go integrated, would become integrated. But he didn't integrate the armed forces. I want to talk about that for a second because his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, she was pushing him on this real hard in the same way that Abigail Adams was pushing her husband, to not forget about the women during the writing of the Constitution and during the American Revolution. Eleanor Roosevelt was really trying to press on her husband, but he saw it as a political impossibility. FDR was not, in his actions, to say nothing of what's in his heart, it might be a different story. He was not progressive on race relations. He didn't integrate the military. He could have. And, you can choose how you want to look at it. Scar on his record. Yeah, you could look at it that way. I think, supporting segregation, because if you're not an anti-racist, you're a racist, right? So if you're supporting segregation, if you have the authority to desegregate the military, and he did, Truman did in 1948. It's all a stroke of a pen. You've seen all these executive orders. Stroke of a pen, desegregate the military. We're fighting against racists in Germany. We're not going to be racist at home. Black and white boys will fight together. Done. All right. There's another side to that. The racism was very, very real. And what would be the effect of putting black and white boys together to fight? And we don't know. I'll tell you this, in the Korean War, black and white boys learned to love each other. Black and white boys learned to count on each other. Die for each other. The same is true in Vietnam. So, so as to not paint too rosy of a picture of FDR, he had the opportunity to take a real strong stand. His wife was pushing to do it. I think he knew right from wrong. He saw it as a political calculation that would have lost him votes in the South, and he saw it as a commander in chief. He saw it as imprudent, detrimental to the unity of the armed forces to end segregation. And, judge if you will, judge as you must. I have my own feelings about this. You can too. But read more, know more, think more, learn about FDR, learn about him. Randolph canceled the march. It was a compromise. And a lot of people call Asa Philip Randolph the father of the civil rights movement. And I was just reading a book. I'm in the middle of reading a book on William Monroe Trotter, who I didn't know much about. Asa Philip Randolph is another. I'm sort of recording this at the day after the 1st of March here. So Black History Month was last month. We talk a lot about King. We talk about X. Maybe we talk about Stokely Carmichael. Here are the names: Asa Philip Randolph. Hear the name William Monroe Trotter. Hear the name W.E.B. Du Bois. These are critically important people, brilliant people. And so that was going on, right, in World War II. You have this war at home. The Congress of Racial Equality was established by another great Chicagoan, James Farmer, and the membership of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, grew tenfold during World War II. Okay. Much more to be said about all that, but we want to talk a little bit about the Latino communities, particularly in LA. I know we have an Angelino in the audience here. So we want to talk about, in the 1930s, Latinos, particularly Mexicans and Mexican Americans, like American people, were deported back to Mexico during the Depression. You're no longer welcome here. You came here to pick the avocados. You came here to pick the apples in Washington. But they were repatriated involuntarily during the Depression, and you had a situation where Latinos were coming back through this bracero program, bracero, brazos, arms, people who work with their arms, people who work with their hands, the U.S. government brought in Mexican laborers to pick California crops because a lot of the, men and women were at war or working in war industries. And so you have these new Latinos, mostly Mexican Americans, who were living in LA, and the sailors would come out and they'd be drinking, they'd be on leave, and they were training. They just got back from a mission, or they're soon to go off to war. They go out to LA and they drink all night, and they go beat up. They call them zooters because it was a fashion. These zoot suits. These were these. You can kind of see them, like they're big, broad-shouldered suits, really like baggy stuff, a lot of extra material, and the casus belli of the attack was to punish these young Latinos for wasting material. Very wasteful. We need all this fabric for war, and here's these kids wearing these suits that are, they look stupid, and they're un-American because they're wasting material. But really, it's because that they're beige, they're brown, they speak with an accent, or they don't speak English well enough, And so the Navy boys would go out and beat them senseless, and it resulted in a riot. In 1943, and so this is the Bracero program that I mentioned. These Mexican guys working out in the field, and the U.S. government promised they'd give them a decent life, but they were basically exploited and oppressed. And then in the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration again forcibly repatriated them through a kind of gross program called Operation Wetback, where they rounded up braceros that were doing the work during World War II, and then put them on ships and dropped them off in the middle of the desert in Mexico, regardless of where they came from. And we'll talk about it. It was pretty yucky. By the way, a lot of Mexican people know about this. Not so many American kids know about this. This is kind of two different stories. Yeah. Native Americans were drafted. I think a lot of natives, you could imagine, they had mixed reactions to being drafted into World War II. The long trail of abuses and usurpations, of tyranny and genocide, and ethnic cleansing at the very least. And then to have to put on a uniform and salute the flag. Look, a lot of natives were and are very, very proud to be American. They could be just as proud to be Navajo or Ojibwa as they are American. They too are large and contain multitudes. It's just so vexed, man. A lot of natives were drafted. Others volunteered. There was something like there was 550 out of the population of 50,000 Navajos, most of whom volunteered to work in the army as code breakers. The Navajo language, I've read. What do I know? But the Navajo language apparently is very unique and very complex, and it's basically like impossible to figure it out, which made it perfect for speaking in code. And so they could just speak their language to each other, and the Japanese and the Germans, they had no idea like what they were saying. So it was a really useful thing. Maybe it's just a fun fact, but it's like an illustration of ingenuity. It's an illustration of the contributions that natives made to the war effort, and it makes it all the more frustrating and downright angering, frankly, that after the war, natives continued to be seen as lesser. You have the rise of the Western movie, and natives are seen as uncivilized and barbaric, and then we'll talk more about that, but it's just endlessly angering. And after the war, by the way, it led to a certain assimilation process where a lot of natives who came to meet people from off the reservation, they found some sort of appeal American life, and they would go live in American cities. All right. So I said I was going to talk a bit about African Americans and Latinos, particularly Mexican Americans and natives. Um, and I tell these stories because I think that, maybe some of the other stories, we've read about and we'll continue to talk about. But I wanted to highlight the contributions of these traditionally discriminated against and disenfranchised members of American society. Um, and I also want to talk about women at war. And apparently that image came with a drum roll, which is charming. Rosie the Riveter, and I think all of us have some sense that women were central to the American victory in World War II. I want to give you some data to substantiate that. You had 350,000 women who joined the military. They worked as nurses. They drove trucks. They repaired planes. Most of them did clerical work. You had 60,000 who were nurses in the Army, and another 14,000 who were nurses in the Navy. You have 25,000 who applied to be WASPs. This is the sort of unfortunate acronym, the Women Auxiliary Service Pilots. There are only a couple thousand of them in the end. Just women who helped to support the American Air Force. 38 of them died. 17 of them died in war. The rest, I think, died in training, which is very common, by the way, particularly back then. And then another 4,500 women spied for the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. The CIA wasn't established until 1947, the early years of the Cold War. So this is just some data. I'm going to give you more numbers. And of course, as always, the lecture notes will be in the description of the video, and you could link to it from there. You had about 5 million women who joined the labor force during World War II. They're often like relocating, picking up, leaving their parents, leaving their homes. Maybe if their husband was off at war, they'd go off to wherever, Michigan, to build aircraft, munitions, cars. A quarter of the aviation workers were women. In 1944, about 37% of adult women were employed. And 35 they were 35% of the civilian labor force. So again, I'm just a lot of numbers just to give you the shape of things. You don't have to memorize this stuff, but think about it, right? So about 1 in 3 civilian laborers were women. About 1 in 3 of adult women were employed outside of the home. The female labor force thus grew by about 50%. Women were their factory participation went up. There were 20% of factory workers, and then it was up to 30 by war's end. And what went down was domestic work. Women were less likely to, be nannies. They were less likely to be housekeepers, yard workers. They went out to the workforce because there was more opportunities to do that, and they could feel like they could serve their country instead of serving some well-to-do who could afford to keep domestic servants. Now, married women, most women who worked outside of the home were unmarried. Most married women were homemakers. They raised children, and that is surely a full-time job. And so the number of married women working outside of the home was up from 14 to 23% during the war. So still, most married women weren't out there working in factories. And even when they went to work, women then, as remains more or less the case, women earn 2/3 of what men make. Today, it's something more like 80%. Those numbers are really complicated. But back then, it was really easy to measure because it was factory jobs. So, a woman who worked in a munitions factory, she made $31 a week. A guy who worked in the same factory, $55 a week. It's just wrong. It's just dead wrong. But that's the data. I wanted to share it with you. And of course, they got excited to do this because they, in part because they were propagandized. Propaganda works. Coffee works. So I like this one on the right. Do the job he left behind, right? So like it's not just that you're serving your country, you're serving your husband by, working in a munitions factory, right? You're honoring his legacy. His legacy is his work. Yeah. Longing won't bring him home Longing won't bring him home sooner. Get a war job. Right? Like it's playing on these certain sexist tropes, and to some degree these sexist tropes worked. And if it didn't, these nasty tropes did, right? This is what happens to your women. Yeah. There's Hitler and just, dead women and screaming children and, a savage Japanese, naked woman. So this propaganda was very effective, and it animated the American people to give of themselves and to the government, to the cause, in ways they never had before. And when women went to work, it gave them some money. Some of it was disposable. Some of it was they needed it desperately. But it led to the post-war boom. Most women in 1944, 65 to 80% of women, when they were polled, this was in December of 1944, they wanted to keep their jobs after the war. Most women did not. And just to contextualize everything, this line here is this purple line, the United States, and you see this big jump in 1940. More and more women are going to war. Women are about 60% of the workforce now. Okay. Sorry, 60% of women are in the workforce. That's the more accurate way to read that. Okay, so those are my notes on women. And, if women were traditionally disenfranchised and discriminated against, so were Japanese people and Japanese Americans. And again, I want to remind you that I really like to rebuke this idea of Japanese internment. It was not just Japanese who were interned, it was Americans of Japanese ancestry, American Americans, They weren't any less American than German Americans or Irish Americans or Italian Americans or African Americans. They're Americans. Now, in 1942, Allied powers were, at a critical moment. Japan was decidedly and decisively winning the war. China was being decimated. Germany controlled all of Western Europe, all of North Africa, almost all of North Africa, and we're pushing deep inside to Soviet territory. Battle of Stalingrad on the horizon. In that same year, an oil refinery near Santa Barbara, California, I think it was in Santa Barbara, maybe it's next to Santa Barbara, just off of Santa Barbara, was bombed by a Japanese submarine, caused some substantial damage, repairable, but substantial. And a few months later, there was a failed Japanese attack on a military base in Oregon. It was terribly failed, but it had a huge psychological impact. Look, we look back now, and most of the war, nearly all of the war, did not take place in American soil, sans Pearl Harbor. But it didn't have to be that way. What was to stop the Japanese from just, bombing LA, bombing San Francisco, bombing Seattle? This is a very real fear. And just because it didn't happen doesn't mean we should, lack empathy for what it must have felt like to fear that. And so in the context of Pearl Harbor, in the context of the two attacks on the American left coast, and in the context of the way the Japanese were treating the Chinese and everyone else, Koreans, and in the context of a long history of anti-Japanese sentiment, through Executive Order 9066, the Roosevelt administration declared the entire West Coast a theater of war. And Japanese Americans were removed, 110,000 of them. They were forcibly interned. A third of them were Issei, foreign-born. 2/3 were American-born. Many, if not most of whom, were American citizens. They had 48 hours to get everything they could and go into what they then called, by the way, a concentration camp. We don't call them concentration camps anymore. That's a very specific term of art. We call them internment camps, and I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with calling it Japanese internment. I am okay with calling them internment camps as opposed to concentration camps because they were not extermination camps. This is a sign, says, pick up your stuff, you're out of here, basically. Okay. In San Francisco, April 1st, 42. The War Relocation Authority removed people to 10 locations in 7 states. The camps were in the middle of nowhere. It was, oftentimes freezing at night, blistering hot during the day. And Japanese people, Japanese Americans, they remain loyal to the United States. I am really, I kind of get emotional thinking about it. Like, they went through hell and they remained loyal. They saw themselves as American, and many, everyone has their own story, and there's a lot of really brilliant narratives written by, a lot of us have read or heard of Farewell to Manzanar, but the oral history of these camps, people, reflecting on their childhood. Maybe you spent the first 5 years of your life in a camp, or you spent your teenage years in a camp. And a lot of Japanese Americans really saw this as their opportunity to prove that they are American. So these camps were in the middle of nowhere. Sorry, I thought I had a map of them. Oh, okay. They were dotted along the middle of nowhere on the West Coast, Arizona, Nevada, California. And I'll put a map in to the next version of the PowerPoint. Of course, you can't just take American citizens and shove them in internment camps because it's illegal, because you have, freedom to assemble, freedom of speech, and you have freedom, from, having your houses occupied. And so this went to the Supreme Court in the Hirabayashi versus the United States case. In June of 43, the Supreme Court unanimously, 9-0, upheld. It could have been 7-0. I forget when we went to 9 Supreme Court justices, but it was, a unanimous upholding of internment because the Supreme Court didn't think that they could intercede in the executive branch's authority to wage war. And Japanese American internment was an executive order that FDR issued in his capacity as commander in chief. Yeah. Now, it kind of makes sense. I don't know that we want to inhabit a space where the Supreme Court can get involved in military decisions. Maybe they should. I don't know, but that was what the court, and it was the Roosevelt court. Roosevelt had packed that court, so that matters. In a less unanimous decision in the Korematsu case in December 44, in the 63 case, the U.S. was once again, protected in its decision to intern Japanese. And by the way, the Hirabayashi and Korematsu cases are still, they've still yet to be overturned. They still have precedent. So if the U.S. goes to war again, which is to say, the U.S. has been at war basically since World War II, but at any time the U.S. is, at war, there is a legal framework established to intern citizens of the country with which the United States is at war. So that's basically law in the United States. So analyze, criticize if you must. The United States realized that they had done something questionable, if not wrong. There was never a single act of sabotage proven. Now, of course, it could be because the Japanese Americans were interned. Some people who defend Japanese American internment say, well, yeah, there were no Japanese that were turncoats, no Japanese Americans that were turncoats. But maybe that's because they were being interned and they would have plotted against the United States. Maybe not because they wanted to, maybe for the money. Maybe the Japanese government would have, given them a fortune for plotting against the United States. So, this is sort of the Schrodinger's cat problem of all of this, right? But in any event, the internment camps were closed in 1946. And, 42 years later, Ronald Reagan apologized and set the stage for a reparations bill. And in 1990, Congress appropriated funds to every surviving internee. And, it was $20,000. A lot of people lost their entire life. They lost, family portraits, one of a kinds. They lost, their family homes. They lost everything. They lost their businesses. And the 3 years that they were put away. But it was a symbolic. Maybe the U.S. was just trying to buy them off. That's a way to look at it. But in the wake of the 1980s, when the U.S. and Japan were mending fences and repairing relationships, it was a token of remorse. And maybe the token wasn't big enough. Maybe there's not a token big enough. Maybe it doesn't work like that. But there's sort of a postscript to the story. I don't know what the right thing to do is there. But $20,000 is a place to start. And there's no repaying for the atomic bombs. So let's get into them. And this will just be like the last 5 minutes or so. The end of the war. So you had the Office of Scientific Research and Development, another executive order, and it was headed by J. Robert Oppenheimer. And their goal is to develop, different radar technologies, all sorts of different technologies, sonar, but also an atomic bomb. And a special team called the Manhattan Project was established out of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. And in July of 1945, so after victory in Europe, remember, victory in Europe was in May of 1945. In July of 1945, they detonated the Trinity bomb in Alamogordo. And it was, what hath God wrought, I swear. What a nightmare. And also, right before they detonated it, the Allies went to Potsdam, just down the street, and the Allies demanded the unconditional surrender of Japan. And by unconditional, they meant unconditional. That the Japanese would have to, maybe be divided in half. North Japan and South Japan, like Korea was to be divided in half, or later Vietnam was to be divided in half. Who knows what the Allies were going to do? Maybe they were going to take some Japanese territory away, the way that some German territory was taken away in 1919. Who knows what was going to happen? You have to surrender unconditionally. Japan said, no, we won't do that. And then Truman's like, well, what are we going to do? And Truman didn't want to have to fight with the Soviets, where like Soviets and Americans would, converge, the Soviets from the north and the Americans from the southeast converge on Tokyo and shake hands and hug. Truman didn't want that because of, they were communists and Stalin's awful human being. So Truman decided, as an effort to revenge Pearl Harbor and to bring the war to an end without having any Americans die, but also to intimidate the Soviet Union and be like, look at what we got. They dropped 2 bombs. August 6th, they dropped Fat Man on Hiroshima. August 9th, they dropped Little Boy on Nagasaki. And Japan was thus forced to accept whatever terms of surrender the Allied powers gave them. And thus, on the 15th of August, 1945, the war ended, as did America's participation in that war. And I conclude here with, on the bottom left, the destruction of Nagasaki, the utter and complete destruction of it. And on the right, the kiss in Times Square. Happy days are here again. DAZE maybe, but happy days are here again in America. The Japanese and the Germans and the Americans all have their different narratives of this war, and that's not the purview of this lecture. But the goal was, in fact, to try to walk you through life in America during the war. I hope I did that reasonably well. It took a few minutes longer than I wanted it to take, but I hope you found it as endlessly interesting as I find it. And I wish you health, I wish you wellness, and I'll see you soon.